often those of us who don't live with food insecurity, who have the luxury of, looking up recipes and finding ingredients, we would have a craving for something that we really wanted to eat and look up a recipe and go and get the ingredients and, stop for this, pick up that, versus looking at what we have in our pantries and our fridges and figuring out what to do with it.
Today on Dirty Linen, we are heading across the seas to Canada. We are talking to food writer Julie Van Rosendaal. She is a prolific cookbook author. She appears on radio in Canada. She's does beautiful recipes, and she's also pretty outspoken on Twitter, which is where I first encountered you, Julie. Welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thanks for having me on.
It's really great to have you on the show. I feel like Australia and Canada are similar in lots of ways. We're so different in other ways, but I feel a real kinship, and I'm really happy to come over to Calgary and hang out with you today.
Yeah, it's too bad we can't be actually eating at a table together, but that's okay. We'll pretend.
Yeah, totally. Well, where I am in Melbourne at the moment, we're in lockdown for the sixth time, whatever it is, lost count. So yeah, no one's eating out yet, but it's not too far. It's not too far in the future. We're getting there. But yeah, tell me about life for you in Calgary at the moment. What are the sort of big things going on there?
Oh, geez. Well, the same things that are going on there. Alberta, Calgary is in Alberta, the province of Alberta, and it's not doing very well in terms of COVID rates these days. The government decided to open up everything over the summer, and now we seem to be paying for it with some really high COVID rates. So restrictions are starting to tighten again a little bit. We're not quite on lockdown again, but there are a lot of restrictions and mandatory vaccinations if you want to, say, eat in a restaurant or, go see a movie, and a lot of pushback about that. So, yeah, it's it's getting to be a long year and a half of sort of navigating the pandemic and to eating a lot of food at home and trying to figure out how to see people that I want to see and do it in a safe way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long grind, that's for sure. I mean, I was looking at the vaccination rates in Canada, and it's over 70% for the 12 plus age group, which, we're told is a reasonably safe count at which to open. Is the rate in Alberta lower than that, or is it, what do you think it is that means that vaccinations not too bad, but cases and hospitalizations are still really high?
Yeah, well, and I don't know exactly what number it is, what percentage is vaccinated. I want to say it's above 70% in Alberta, but I don't have the number in front of me. But the ICUs are completely overloaded. We've had to have the Red Cross come in. We've had some medical teams come from Newfoundland to help out and open up some new ICU beds. So the hospitals are completely just overloaded with COVID patients. They're canceling surgeries, and the rates, just keep going up because of that sort of small percentage of the population that's unvaccinated. So, and the rates are going up among the under 12 set as well. There was a 14-year-old who passed away over the weekend in Alberta. And so it's very worrying for parents of kids who are under 12 and, going to school. Schools are open. But the Board of Education, the large Board of Education in Calgary, has mandated that all staff have to be double vaccinated as of, I believe, the end of this month. And so that's going to cause some problems as well, because they're already running out of substitutes, staff. There's staff issues. So that's what led to the schools closing in the spring. And so it's likely that will happen again. Did I even answer your question?
Yeah, I think you did. I think the short answer is it's a lot, and it's devastating to hear of people dying of COVID and to hear of a 14-year-old. I mean, that's just gut-wrenching. The rules around being vaccinated to enter workplaces such as restaurants, I mean, are they sort of being retrofitted, or was that the rule from the beginning?
Well, that was something that a lot of people pushed for a long time, was the vaccine passport, is what it's sort of being referred to, just proof of vaccination, essentially. And it took the Alberta government quite a while to implement it. And they did, 3 weeks ago, maybe. And so, that has incentivized some people who hadn't been vaccinated to get vaccinated. But, I don't think enough. So yeah, that's something that that a lot of people think sort of has helped, but it's a bit late. It's sort of come into play a little bit late. And then there are confusing rules. There are still events are still allowed, and so gatherings are restricted among the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. There are restrictions on dining in restaurants, going into retail stores, things like that. But then there are sort of rules that allow for larger special events, that aren't quite as regulated. So it's really frustrating, and it's really frustrating for a lot of people and small business owners, especially the hospitality industry, people who, are vaccinated and want to get together it was Canadian Thanksgiving this past weekend. And so, the people who were vaccinated were only allowed to gather, I think, with one other cohort group. But if you're outside, you could gather with up to 20 people. I mean, there are all these rules that kind of keep changing, and everyone's kind of trying to navigate. But then, you have this sort of small percentage of the population that is so actively protesting the restrictions and the vaccine passport. And even though that it's, predominantly the unvaccinated who are in the ICUs, and the death toll every day is, between 10 and one day it was 34 last week, I believe was the highest day. And so it's just really frustrating to see. And especially with all these surgery cancellations, the Children's Hospital had a large percentage of their surgeries canceled, all elective surgeries canceled. We were hearing stories about people with brain tumors and cancer diagnoses that are having their surgeries canceled, or organ transplants, just having their surgeries canceled indefinitely. So that's going to cause more, not just anxiety, but certainly more, illnesses and death as people don't get the treatment that they require.
Yeah, I think it's so complex, and there's so many implications of just letting this thing run riot. I guess that's what we're hoping we're going to avoid in Australia as we reopen. But yeah, certainly looking at places like Canada was a bit of a cautionary tale with we really do have to protect our health system so carefully, because any of us could get hit by a bus tomorrow.
Well, and that's the thing, right? We sort of take for granted we have this fantastic healthcare system in Canada, and we take it for granted that it's going to be available to us when we need it. And now that's the frustrating part is, they're starting to triage patients, and my understanding is that it's going by age. And if my parents had an accident or a heart attack, they might not be able to get the treatment because they're older, which is just something we've never had to deal with before, right? So I think people just don't quite understand that.
I saw one of your posts recently about not putting knives in the sink, and it's just like that you.
Yes, all these things.
Tell me about that.
And a friend said that her husband went mountain biking a couple of weekends ago and broke his neck, and he was fine, but was at the hospital. And I was like, you guys, we can't do these things, like all these small things that we kind of dangerous activities, day-to-day activities, we just we take for granted that help will be available because it always has been, and it just might not be. And the hospitals are so overloaded, all the healthcare workers are so exhausted and overworked. So it's, I think it's something that we all have to start considering, is not putting knives in the sink and not cutting frozen bagels and all these things that might have us wind up in emerge.
Yeah, don't have an avocado in the palm of your hand and just like slash at the stone with a knife. Put the guard on the mandolin. Put a rag around the hot pot handle. We're not allowed to hurt ourselves.
No, cereal for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's so crazy, isn't it? I mean, I know you've written all these cookbooks. You're obviously, you're like me. You're obsessed with food. It's all you think about. But it's so crazy that we spend the first 10 minutes of our conversation talking about a pandemic and about hospitals and about these broader societal issues. It's really changed it up, hasn't it?
It has changed everyone's perspective, everyone's priorities. Like, there's just been a huge shift in so many aspects of our lives. We've really started to pay more attention to our communities and realize how we can support each other in our communities. And I think sometimes it's, these huge situations and huge problems that seem like insurmountable. And, there's nothing I can do to help, our healthcare system or make sure people are fed. But I think the key is having all of us pay closer attention to the people around us and realize that there's a lot that we can do that makes a big, big difference, in the lives of people in our immediate communities. And if we all do that, it's not as big a problem, and we can take care of each other. We really just need to do that.
What kinds of things have you seen around you, or have you indeed been doing yourself to do that work for the community?
Oh, well, I mean, early on in the pandemic, as soon as they declared a pandemic and closed the schools last March, my sister is a principal, and I just know how, I have a teenager. I know how many kids are, rely on the school breakfast and lunch programs. We don't have a national lunch program, but there are sort of emergency lunch programs and breakfast programs at schools that a lot of kids rely on. So with the schools closed, I knew a lot of kids would be cut off from a source of food, and a lot of kids who are left to their own devices. There are a lot of resources available for adults, but not a lot for kids. And, a lot of the agencies kind of pivoted to handing out gift cards or mailing out gift cards, which is not something that's accessible to kids. A 6-year-old can't go grocery shopping. And so, right off the bat, there was just this sort of flurry of surplus food with all the restaurants closing, and the culinary school had 10,000 pounds worth of, produce and meat and cheese and things they had to get rid of. And, all the agencies had their storage was full, their freezers and fridges were full. So there was all this food sort of moving around. And I knew some teachers at a really high needs school who, the Monday morning after schools closed, they were back at school handing out the food that they had left in the school. And so I started directing some of the food that was coming my way, because I know a lot of chefs, I know a lot of people in the food community, a lot of producers, and and the food, hunger related agencies. And so it sort of quickly, we started moving this food around, and I called a friend who has a very high-end restaurant. It was on the top 100 list not long ago. Just an amazing old, century house that has been transformed into a restaurant. And I said, can we start putting stuff in your walk-in? And he said, sure. So anyway, we started preparing all these ingredients. A bunch of chefs from SAIT, which is has a amazing culinary arts program, and chefs who were not working, we opened up the kitchen at Rouge, it was a Rouge restaurant, and started turning all the surplus food into meals and setting up these sort of safe distribution points around the city. So we ended up having 13 distribution points and distributing hundreds of meals a day for until the fall, until the schools opened again. So that was sort of a big thing that we did last year. But more recently, everyone has been really it's just frustrated by just wanting to do something for our healthcare workers, and I think that frustration, that sort of feeling of helplessness is in its own self is something that, that's hard on people. And so watching, our healthcare system sort of be weighed down and start to sort of collapse, and knowing that the nurses and the doctors and the administrators and the cleaners, all these people are just pushed to their limit. And, everyone wants to send food, and you can't do that. You can't just, show up with a casserole or cookies, which is sort of a universal way of showing support, right? Feeding each other is something we can all do. We all have to eat. It's very personal, and it's very emotional, and it's just that gesture of feeding somebody. And so, I have a friend who has a catering business who actually took over the lunch operation last summer when it got big, and the catering companies are losing all their business because events are closed, right? So it's not just the restaurants, it's the caterers, and she had, a lot of storage. She had the delivery trucks. And so I've been working with her on the lunches last year. And so she was messaging me saying, what can we do about the healthcare workers? And at the same time, the staff from ICUs around Calgary were messaging me, with similar thoughts. And so I connected one, woman from an ICU nurse with Javal, who owns Devour Catering, and they had sort of a small group of people who collected some money and had some meals delivered to this one unit. Anyway, so she put a post together on her website with an order form, $15. You can buy a meal and treats and, this whole sort of care package for an ICU worker. And then once we get up to 50, we'll send, a load over to one of the ICUs and coordinate with Alberta Health Services and make sure that we do it in a safe way. And because there are 50 staff on any given shift at an ICU. And anyway, so within, 3 days, she had to stop it because 6,500 meals had been purchased. People just were they just want to do something, and she was getting calls from, the people who, lived alone and were on a fixed income and said, can I purchase one meal? And people who would call and buy 100 meals or 50 meals. And it's just this range of it's just amazing. So I got to go and help her deliver Thanksgiving dinners over the weekend. She did, special turkey dinners for everyone who was working at all the hospitals. And it's just, I think people having that ability to do something, and even small gestures like, having a meal delivered and a card. They had 10 teenagers made handmade thank you cards for every single delivery. And it just makes a huge difference, Yeah, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a difference to the people who are doing it and, being generous. And I'm sure it makes a massive difference to the people who are receiving it. But you're right. People really want to feel like, what can I do? People ache to do something, don't they? Julie, I know that Canadian Thanksgiving is a few weeks ahead of the US version. Tell me about Thanksgiving in Canada.
Oh, boy. Well, yeah, it's the first weekend of October, and first weekend or second weekend? Geez, it's already mid-October. How is this? How is it mid-October already?
I don't know how that happened.
I don't know either. And then, the U.S. Thanksgiving is closer to Christmas. It's way farther ahead. And of course, very tied to colonization. And in Canada, it was not declared a holiday until 1957. And it was declared a holiday that celebrates the harvest and, things that you're thankful for. And it gives, people an opportunity to gather. And so the focus is very much on gathering and giving thanks for, all we have, and making use of the harvest. And, early October, it's perfect time for, all kinds of things that are in season. And so that's sort of how I've always seen it. And a lot of people in Canada see it that way. But the two are, with the same name, Thanksgiving, they're very, people connect them to each other, and a lot of people in the States say, what is Canadian Thanksgiving? Like, what is that? Because, in the US, it's all about the Mayflower, right? And and so we didn't have that. So why is there a Canadian Thanksgiving? So it is more about harvest and gathering and giving thanks and that kind of thing.
Okay. And so, I mean, what's good right now in Canada? Like, what are you harvesting? What's good on the table? What's good to cook with at the moment?
Oh, well, it depends where you live. I'm in the prairies, so
it's a massive country. Hey,
it is massive. Yeah. And, the seasons, obviously the terroir is different across the country, and the seasons are a little bit different. It's been snowing here for the last 2 days. I mean, not really staying on the ground, but there's been snow already. And so I see, pictures on Instagram from my friends in BC and even out in Toronto, and things are still blooming. And so in Alberta, there's a lot of root vegetables. There's a lot of peppers and a lot of stone fruits that come from BC next door. A lot of plums, apples, of course, apples and pears are in season. I just went and dug out the last of my carrots and beets because the ground froze last night. And I'm going to need to get my potatoes out too. But all kinds of produce in season right now.
Through this massive disruption of the pandemic, as a writer of recipes and someone who's, thinking about how people want to eat, what have you noticed in terms of how people want to eat and want to cook? I mean, obviously home cooking's become a bigger part of many people's lives, but do you think that the way people have, changed their cooking and eating lives has brought actual change, or do you think it's just been for this period?
Oh, no, I think it's going to change the way people approach, meal times for a long time. And you're right, people have cooked more this past year and a half than ever before. Like the amount of dishes that, it just never stops, because we sort of take for granted that we might stop for coffee or, grab lunch out. And the majority of Canadians ate lunch away from home before the pandemic. And now people are, at home for lunch. They are maybe, if they're working from home, they're, putting in a stew at lunchtime, like they're home to sort of have the oven on and prepare their dinner. Before the pandemic, a third of Canadians followed some sort of dietary regime, whether it was veganism, vegetarian, paleo, Whole30, whatever, like whether it was a program or just sort of a way of eating. And I'd be really curious what the statistics are now, because I think it really has shaken up people's view of food, and people haven't had the luxury, I mean, financially or time-wise, or, going to the grocery store is not the same experience that it was. So my guess is that number has dropped significantly. And people have really learned to use what they have. It used to be we would, to some degree it still is, but, we would often, those of us who don't live with food insecurity, who have the luxury of, looking up recipes and finding ingredients, we would come across something on Instagram or Pinterest, or, have a craving for something that we really wanted to eat, and look up a recipe and go and get the ingredients and, stop for this, pick up that, versus looking at what we have in our pantries and our fridges and figuring out what to do with it. And I think that's a really specific skill that, a lot of people don't have and have had the opportunity to to figure out what to do with what they have, especially early in the pandemic when we weren't going to grocery stores as freely. We've sort of become more accustomed to navigating, wearing our mask and keeping a distance. But early on, people were going to the depths of their deep freezes and eating like their fruitcake from last Christmas, just, eating everything they have. And I spent so much time last year answering questions about, sourdough and, how to make your own bread. And people were running out of yeast and we saw such a surge in baking, partly because it's comforting, and even just the smell of baking. I've always, if I'm at home working, and I've worked from home for a long time, so I'm kind of used to it. But I would plan when my son was coming home from school, and if I had something to make or bake, I would put it in the oven then, so that he walked into the smell of something baking, and things like that make a huge difference to our psyches, and so we were baking for each other, we were baking together, we were baking with our kids because the kids were off school, and what do you do with kids who can't play with their friends? And, we were using it as a teaching tool. And so I think a lot of people learn to make bread, they learn to bake, they learn to be more self-sufficient, versus running to the grocery store. Maybe they got into the habit of making, a batch of buns for their burgers or whatever. I started taking my son to the fridge and saying, okay, let's look at what's in here and try and think of what to do with it, just to sort of get him into that habit. And I think people are figuring out how to use substitutions, rather than following a recipe exactly and running out for cilantro or picking up, this or that they need for their specific dish, figuring out how they can leave it out or substitute something else. And yeah, I think there's been a huge, it's been a big experience in terms of learning how to cook.
Yeah, I'm nodding furiously at everything you're saying. I think definitely that I guess frugality or resourcefulness about looking in the fridge and seeing what's there, or letting meals tumble from one to the next. Whether it's cooking up some leftovers from dinner for lunch, or even scrambling them up with some eggs for breakfast. I think because people have had to relate so much more to what food is in their house. It's not like, you make something for dinner, then the next 2 nights you eat out, and then you look at it and it looks like just scungy old leftovers. You don't want to deal with them. But when you look at the food in your fridge every day, or multiple times a day, or for me, like maybe 4,000 times a day, then you really do, you do need to relate to it more. And I think people have also, even to do with things like, we've had empty supermarket shelves early in the pandemic, which is something most people have never experienced before. I mean, you do start to think about food waste and about putting a value on food. And it is a real shift, which there's so many good things about that attention, and I hope that it it is maintained. But do you have a sense of what that means for eating out, for the kinds of experiences that people want in restaurants, or for the ways that chefs want to cook for people?
Well, yeah. And I mean, chefs have really had to figure out how to work as takeout operations, which has been so hard. I mean, the restaurant industry is, the profit margin sort of averages 2 to 4% in the restaurant industry. So there's just not a lot of room there. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when people start to, they can eat out here again with restrictions and with, proof of vaccination and the masking. And I believe you're only allowed to eat with one other cohort group. Anyway, people are starting to eat out again, but they're really focusing on, where to go and paying attention to supporting, small independent restaurants and treating it like, in the old days when it was a special occasion to go out to a restaurant and you didn't do it very often. I mean, it's become such a part of our day-to-day lives, and we might not go to a fancy restaurant and spend a lot of money. We might go to a food truck or like go out for tacos or go, sort of for a casual lunch or for coffee. It's more a part of our sort of culture than it was 30 years ago, So I think it's sort of gone back to that, okay, we're going to go out for dinner. It's going to be a special occasion. It's, we're going to plan it. We're going to consider where to go because we haven't been out for a year. And it's sort of going to go back to that sort of really a special occasion event rather than a day-to-day, where should we eat tonight and pop in kind of thing.
Yeah, which I think is great in so many ways, especially, with those slim profit margins you talk about. I think if restaurants are able to, if customers are able to meet restaurants halfway and maybe increasing those profit margins a little bit by spending a little bit more, then I think that's a good thing. But then I suppose on the flip side, you don't want those more modest establishments to fall by the wayside because people just aren't eating like that anymore. I guess you just sort of hope that there's going to be a place for all kinds of food businesses, all positions in the market. But I think there's definitely something to be said for the restaurant experience becoming special again.
Yes. And I mean, in general, when there are times of, when there's a recession, historically, those sort of mid-range restaurants and the chain restaurants tend to be the ones that do better because people see them as not as much of a risk. They might not go to a fine dining restaurant or try a new place, but they'll go to sort of those sort of comfortable, not too pricey restaurants where they know what they're going to get. And I think that one of the things that we need to sort of think about around the world, because the hospitality industries around the world are being, just devastated by the pandemic. And, in Canada, 25% of our young people have jobs in hospitality, right? So when you look at the hospitality industry, how many people they employ, not just the restaurants themselves, but, food service, the people who do the linens, the farmers and the producers. And it's such a big part of our economy that, keeping them going really keeps our economy going, keeps people fed. It addresses food insecurity as well to keep these people, employed as much as we can. And I think that we need to be creative about how we direct our pandemic relief funds. There's so much money going towards the agencies that deal with hunger that have limited capacities, right? That can't necessarily do more to feed people than they already are. A lot of agencies have closed their kitchens, are working under reduced numbers of volunteers because they can't have the corporate volunteer groups that used to come in. And I think figuring out creative ways to get these kitchens feeding people and directing those relief funds. I mean, in Canada, just hundreds of millions of dollars are sort of going towards helping feed people, but I'm not convinced that a lot of that money is actually translating to more people being fed. But so for example, all these underused restaurant kitchens and catering kitchens. The one thing that I had been talking to the Calgary Food Bank about for years is having these kitchens utilize some of their surplus ingredients. At any given time, they have, tons of extra lentils or extra potatoes. During the pandemic, there was this huge surplus of potatoes because all the restaurants were closed, and so many of those potatoes went for French fries in restaurants, right? And so we had just a surplus of potatoes across Canada. And in Calgary, the food bank had, more potatoes than they could distribute. It was taking up their storage space. They don't have kitchens there, so they couldn't do anything with them. And so we started this pilot project where I gathered up a few caterers that I know, who, all events had been canceled, so they really hadn't. They were just trying to cobble together, frozen meal kits and things like that. But they had all these this capacity to produce a lot of food and to deliver it and to store it. And so they started taking surplus potatoes, surplus pasta, lentils, stock, whatever the food bank had, and processing it into usable meals that they then gave back to the food bank to distribute. And those meals are more useful for people who might not have the time, the culinary skills, the kitchen tools, the supplemental ingredients to take a bag of potatoes and some pasta and some beans or some, these raw ingredients and turn them into meals. And so that, and that helps the food bank. It helps them feed more people. It helps keep these businesses, helps them keep their lights on, pay their staff. Like, it's just all good. And so I actually have a meeting with the CEO of the food bank on Friday to talk about doing more, because, this kind of, pairing up of small businesses with the agencies that have the funding, I think is key. And it's something that we kind of have to think creatively about, and how to tap into these underused kitchens. And that's what they do, is feed people. They have the food handling permits, they have the safe kitchen spaces, and what they don't have is the money.
Yeah, it's such a great example of the kind of creativity that I think we've seen in so many arenas through the pandemic, where, people such as yourself identify a need, identify a solution, and you just need those magical links. Someone that can sort of see the big picture. And I think it's in so many ways, there's been opportunities for people to join the dots in the way society works and, of course, doesn't work, and things that could perhaps be done better. Well, congratulations. It sounds so worthwhile, and just does good at every level. Julie, as a prolific cookbook author, I would love to just have a little chat to you about something that I've been reading a lot about over the past couple of days. And I don't know if you have, but it's a cookbook called Makan, was withdrawn from sale in the UK because it had been discovered or alleged that the author had plagiarized some elements from another author whose book had been published, I think, in 2012. Have you been following this?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Oh, well, you'll have to catch up on it. But I suppose, what I'd love to talk to you about is this whole idea of originality in recipes and sort of where it lies, originality and attribution. And I think, it's often, this is the conversation around this one is a lot around appropriation, in a particular cultural space, which is non-your food, and food from East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so there's that whole side of it, which is quite particular. It's obviously so important that people of color are given platforms and elevated, and there's also a lot of cultural appropriation that goes on with white authors. But I just wondered, from your experience as a recipe author, how do you think about originality and authenticity? I know it's a big question to throw at you without notice, but what do you think about it? Like you're doing, I don't know, a chicken soup or a lasagna or a sourdough or something. How do you think about who it belongs to? Oh,
and you're right. That's such a big conversation to have, because all food comes from somewhere and is influenced by the people and the immigration patterns of an area and the terroir and the seasons and our cultural traditions, and so that the concept of authenticity when it comes to food, that, I know it's not what you asked me. You asked me about cookbook authoring, but some people are very hung up on what makes an authentic taco or an authentic, and does it matter, in terms of, if you're going out for the experience of eating it and it's delicious and it came from a person who, took a variety of experiences and,
turn them into something delicious.
Yeah. So, so in terms of writing cookbooks, this is a good question, because, a lot of people say, oh, I saw someone was just saying to me recently, oh, this, the store, I saw them making your wild rice salad. And I was like, it's not my wild rice salad. Well, but it had, the same kind of fruits and the same kind of, and this is the tricky thing is there's so many similarities in recipes, and who invented the lemon bar. We know who invented the chocolate chip cookie, but does everyone credit the inventor of the chocolate chip cookie when they do a chocolate chip cookie recipe? People always often say, oh, my chocolate chip cookie recipe. And when all chocolate chip cookie recipes have the same essential ingredients, they all have butter and brown sugar and white sugar and egg and vanilla and flour and baking soda and salt and chocolate, right? And it's the ratios and sometimes the technique, that gives them a different texture. And so really, if you write a chocolate chip recipe, guaranteed there's another chocolate chip cookie recipe that is exactly the same out there somewhere. And I live in fear that I'm going to, come up with something that someone else has done. And it actually happened a while ago. Years ago, I was trying to come up with something for my column. I'm on CBC Radio in Calgary, and I was trying to come up with something for Easter, and I didn't make hot cross buns early enough. And then I thought, oh, I'll make hot cross scone or hot cross Irish soda breads. So I was thinking of scones, and I thought, oh, little Irish soda breads, because they have the sort of cross on top. And so I made them, and I thought, well, I was patting myself on the back for being so smart. And then like a week later, I saw, someone posted them on Instagram or somewhere. And I was like, oh, and so I looked, and it was someone who had done it before me. And I was so horrified that I was like, oh no, like everyone's going to think that I took her idea. You know what I mean? And so, so when it comes to actual recipes, you can't own a recipe. You can plagiarize a recipe. But you cannot own, can you imagine if you could own a recipe? Every big food would own every combination of ingredients out there. And so I've had recipes that I worked really hard on show up in other cookbooks, but I think food is for sharing. I don't get too bent out of shape about it, but yeah, it's tricky because, like you said, you do a recipe for like roasted chicken or a pumpkin loaf or like all these things that are very common, and all the recipes out there are very similar. And
it's a tricky one. It's like, I think the main problem with this book wasn't the recipes as such. It was the stories around them. And it was, the original author had talked about, the way that her mother or her aunties made something and the way the kitchen was organized and all these quite specific details. And then they were kind of, barely changed in the more recent book. So I think it's like taking a method or, like coming up independently with a method that happens to be the same, whatever it is. I suppose that's quite different from borrowing somebody's own life story. But I totally can imagine that feeling of the soda bread, the hot cross soda breads. It's like, I suppose it's like, often you hear about it in music as well, where, it's like, wasn't this part of the melody lifted from somewhere else? And you just sort of think a lot of stuff is just, out there in the ether, and inspiration can strike in, who knows how, sometimes it just lands on you. But it's, I don't know, I think it's such a big conversation. I think it's great that in the food media these days, there is more space to have conversations around cultural appropriation and the joy of authenticity, but also the burden of it, and, how important is it, and who holds the key, and, all that stuff. It's a really interesting space. And I think, again, I think the pandemic has, obviously it's been, anyway, there's a lot of big topics going on, but I'm just thinking, of course, we've had Black Lives Matter in amongst everything, and there's been some food publishing scandals, I don't know, quote unquote scandals in in the US media and elsewhere. And so there should be. But it just feels like it's definitely a great time of reckoning in so many ways.
I agree. And we need, we definitely need to have more voices and more perspectives and, stories.
What is your cookbook that's coming out later in the year?
Oh, it's a cookie cookbook.
Oh, great.
And, I went back to self-publishing and just wanted to do a series of small format, single subject books. And I was working on a different book that it just wasn't coming together very well. And it was, I kept running up against these obstacles and recipes weren't working, and it was all just very bizarre. And I actually one day said, okay, I'm going to look at my horoscope, and whatever my horoscope says to do, I'm going to do that. And I looked at which is kind of unlike me, but I've been doing some strange things during the pandemic, and a couple times I noticed a horoscope in my feed that was really accurate. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go and look. And the horoscope said, if you're not sure that a project is going to work, don't do it, and set it aside for later. And I was like, oh, that's really specific. So I switched, but I still wanted to do a book. And I thought, one thing that I can pull together fairly quickly is a cookie book, because I have all these cookie recipes that I have made for years. I had a cookie bakery back in the 90s that I don't think a lot of people even know. And my first book was a cookie book, and it came out in 1999. So it's, kind of like a 21-year anniversary of my cookie book. So I pulled together this cookie cookbook for the holidays, and I actually just got the first page proofs today. Maybe that's why my brain is not working. And trying to, and I really strongly dislike this part of it, because every time I see my work, I want to change it. And so when the proofs come back from the printer, I just want to instantly change everything, which of course it's a little bit too late for. I just need to check for typos and color and things like that. But yeah, that should be out in first week of November, because I'm getting it printed in Canada. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. Great.
Well, congratulations on that. And thank you so much for covering all the big topics with me today on Dirty Linen. It's been really fantastic to have you on the show, Julie. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me on. This has been so much fun. I loved it.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This